Okay, so part two of this week's lecture is looking at a specific study that Daniel Miller did, that he then released in a book called The Comfort of Things. So in this huge study, it seems like such a privilege to be able to do a study like this, to do 100 houses in a typical London street. Essentially what Miller did was go into people's houses, obviously with permission.
Yes.
It's like the usual ethics applications apply, and people volunteered to be part of this. And spent time with people in their houses and got them to kind of reflect on the things that were in their houses, from the furniture through to specific items, what he called a typical London street. So the book, Comfort of Things, ends up with 30 portraits out of this study. It's, again, a book I would highly recommend in terms of it's so readable. Some of the passages in it are just actually quite beautiful. So I've recommended this to people that aren't into sociology,
Yes.
and they've really dug it. It's quite something. The book starts with two portraits of people, empty and full. One is of George's house that's like empty and bereft of stuff, and others like of a family with full house, and it really used to kind of contrast people's materiality, in the sense that he's trying to make a point that people that have connections with things often have stronger connections with people as well. So the whole book is kind of a celebration of ups and downs of people's lives, the way things give people meaning and the way they relate to those ups and downs, the way that things create security and comfort, and particularly, as we've been talking about at length really, the way they mediate our relationships with other people. So Miller and his research team talked about like leaving George's house in tears, that they was kind of so affected by the kind of dearth of things, but also how they argued this related to the way that this old man related to his life. So there's a long quote there. I won't read the whole thing, but George's flat was disorienting not because of anything that was in it, but because of what it wasn't in it. It had the most basic carpet and furniture, but throughout their time doing this research, they met lots of people that were having troubles and issues, facing disease or whatever, and there's often no escaping the horrors of different people's lives. But for the researchers, they found after meeting George, they found themselves in tears after leaving his flat, because in every other instance there was at least a sense that at least the person had once lived. It's talking about the other people that had gone through tragedies or whatever. With George, by contrast, one could simply not escape the conclusion that this was a man more or less waiting for his time on earth to be over, but who at the age of 76 had never yet seen it actually begin, and worse, that he knew it. What Miller's trying to do here is relate this kind of absence of things in George's life, of like photos of other people,
Yes.
of like spoons or of magnets on the fridge of places that he's been, and the way these things kind of represent a life. There was none of this in George's house. It wasn't that he'd kind of downsized or made a decision to kind of get rid of stuff.
Wipe things clean, yeah.
He'd actually never really done anything.
Yeah.
He'd basically lived his life in this kind of really austere way that was lonely. He didn't really leave his flat, his suburb, very much. For Miller, the way that he led his life is then represented in the lack of materiality in his house,
Yes.
and vice versa. It's not a kind of dichotomy, it's kind of the same thing. Another example that Miller talks about that I think is particularly interesting sociologically, particularly in terms of the class aspects of this and the way that consumption is thought of generally, is the example of Marina. Marina grew up in a really stuffy, rich household where the furniture was, old, drawers that are hard to open and close, and like her, she couldn't get her own undies out of a drawer because it was too hard when she was a kid. She remembers this being like a problem. She never really shares the taste of her parents for some reason. So she talked about her parents as being cold, a facade of icy politeness and refusal to discuss anything in her household. She knew with absolute clarity from an early age that she didn't want to be like them. When she had kids, obviously people that have kids, parents often have things to say about the way to raise those kids, and she was quite determined to do the opposite of the way that she was raised. What she owed to her parents was a masterclass in how not to parent. So how did she do this? Well, and Marina was a middle-class professional too, by the way. So, so in repudiation of her snobby parents, she bought all her furniture from IKEA. Yeah. Her parents hated this, found it distasteful. But IKEA stuff's easy to use. So kids could open the drawers, it's easy to move around.
And didn't smell.
Didn't smell like old
stuffy smell.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So the quote here is, I went and bought my child's chest drawers from IKEA, and I bought it from IKEA because it was easy to open the drawers, and it was good. And I could build it myself, and it was £200, not £600. And it didn't smell like it used to have worms in it. Her mother's reaction to this kind of purchase of IKEA stuff was like as if she'd spat in her face. And Marina enjoyed this reaction. So again, you can see the kind of deep emotional relationships that happen through stuff here.
And didn't we raise you to have better taste?
Yeah,
I think there's that sort of stuff in this recollection in the book. Yeah.
So there's things here that relate to ideology, but you couldn't call this behaviour ideological.
Yes.
So, in terms of also moving away from the horrible, stuffy meal times that she didn't enjoy as a kid, Marina discovered that if she went to McDonald's once a week with the kids and got a Happy Meal, it was a way of bonding with the children because there was toys. They could go home and watch the movies. And there was even like this Snoopy collection where it was like Snoopies from all around the world, so they could go home and get on the computer and look up, if it was Snoopy from Iceland, they would look up Iceland and talk about Iceland. So it was this educational thing. So they developed the rituals around this kind of meal to eat, to play, to learn, to put the stickers on, to do the puzzles. That was kind of fun. But what's interesting about this is the Marina's friends were also horrified by this, because McDonald's for middle-class professionals is distasteful, it's unsustainable, all those kind of things that we associate with McDonald's. So as Marina says, she's well aware of the virtual class war which erupts around these issues of taste. Her middle-class friends try to persuade her that McDonald's hamburgers are largely composed of animal brains, probably are, but she in turn disparages the way they try to take their children to unsuitable restaurants. And this is something that bugs a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, kids, they're just little monkeys, really. You can't really enjoy a meal with children of that age, and they throw everything on the floor. So you can see here she's talking about the way that families often take their kids to small cafes, and these little spaces where the kids there are annoying everyone and no one has a good time. It's important here to say here, too, that not all the meals that Marina did was Macca's. It was only kind of once a week or so.
But it's also interesting to think about that in Australia, what's happened to pubs, for example. In that many pubs, particularly those that were sort of becoming redundant, have become places you take families, and they're almost in lots of ways our equivalent to McDonald's in a sense.
Well, they've used the McDonald's model. They build playgrounds in pubs now.
Playgrounds.
Like that,
They there's usually space to run around, even if there's no equipment.
Yep.
There's a short menu for kids, which means their food comes quickly. It's often McDonald's-like. It's probably slightly better quality.
Yep. Cheeseburger, nuggets.
Yep. Yeah, and it means parents can sit and socialise, and so kids get fast food, parents get slow meal because there's playing and other things. You get colouring in, you get all kinds of stuff. So very much the McDonald's model in a kind of gastropub experience at a sort of slightly higher cost, which satisfies middle class sensibilities.
Yeah,
and also
clubs are doing this as well. Yeah,
clubs are doing it
using the bowling greens as play spaces and stuff.
Exactly, and so it is really interesting to see how that has spread to kinds of the way we consume meals and time together in these different ways.
That's right, and you could argue that that's been an aspect of McDonaldization in a sense.
Absolutely.
But it's really not just kind of conformity going on there. There's actual kind of relationships and things going on in that space that are not necessarily rational and ideological. So I think that's a really good example. Another example in the book is Dave, who was a kind of working class fella that had a lot of problems with drugs in his past, and he'd had a heroin addiction. And he talked about how his music collection and his photo albums were central to kicking heroin, and not just kicking, but then kind of staying off heroin. So the quote here is, the sheer weight of these material resources seemed to keep Dave from floating off in this haze of drink, heroin and desperation that he'd experienced in the past. Their weight lay in their specificity. Each CD album contained a multitude of tracks, each photo album was full of images, and each track and every image was grounded in a particular memory of time. So for Dave, he kind of used these as almost like a crutch or a way of kind of distracting himself, or a way of kind of thinking about why he needed to stay off heroin. Photos of his kids and friends and stuff like that allowed him to kind of then go, okay, I'm doing it for these people, and I need to, do the right thing here. So again, here you can see how consumer products, these things in someone's houses, Records could be seen as kind of the great thing of cultural industries, right? They're like, rock bands and the, $1 million industry or whatever. But for individually using them, they can have really deep meanings that are attached to nostalgia, to a trip, to a person, that go beyond the kind of use value of the product itself. So, what does Miller... There's some examples, and again, I highly recommend having a look at this book. What does Miller have to say about, what all this means? So, in my research, it became clear that the people who develop strong and multiple relationships with things are the same people who develop strong and multiple relationships with people. While those who find it difficult to maintain their relationships with commodities are the same people who have problems maintaining their relationships with other persons. Now, this essentially inverts the way that most sociological critique of consumption happens, that the idea that people are like commodity fetishizing things, they're narcissistic and more kind of worried about owning stuff than, having relationships with people. Miller argues strongly against this. Now, again, we could come up with empirical examples that go against Miller. But what Miller is talking about here is the more day-to-day, everyday life kind of aspects of these things. This is a pretty controversial idea in a way. Rather than people being seduced into going into debt to buy things that people that don't like to impress people. Sorry, to buy things that they don't need to impress people that they don't like. Which is a kind of way that most people think about consumer culture. Miller's arguing the opposite here.
And it's not as if he doesn't believe those things don't exist, but he's saying overall, if we look at it from this perspective, we see a different thing.
Yes.
And I think when you think back to George and his empty apartment, it's also the fact that no one gave him anything.
Yes.
Like our places often are full of things people give you. You're not even really sure if you want, but you put it up and put it on display, or leave it here or there, and books people give you,
really good
and paintings and photos and things and stuff people got you from holiday, and the space around you becomes full of things that relate to people you've known or know you or want to be part of your lives. And an absence of those people means an absence of those things. Yeah. Unless you're sociopathic and hide everything in a cupboard and don't let it out. But he's talking about, in most people's lived experience, that connection is strong. And I think there's something very, very powerful in that. Like we said earlier, he's more generous to people and saying, just because people have a connection to things doesn't mean they're antisocial or they value objects over humans. But in fact, these things work in relationships with each other. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And I think this is beautifully drawn out in this last quote, particularly the bolded bit there. So, for Miller, from a sociological, anthropological point of view, when it comes to studying things, our job is to confront and expose the crafty life of things. So, again, what he's talking about here is their effects and the way that they kind of form our orientation towards each other through these things. So, material things in general have a strange and little understood humility. After all, objects are concrete, upfront, evident to the eye, yet they work generally as background, as that which frames behaviour and atmosphere. And the atmosphere thing I think is really important. They do this job the best when they are not noticed. So, and this is the bit I particularly like about this. You compliment the painting, you are not supposed to notice the frame. You tell a woman she is beautiful, not only that her makeup is brilliant. You comment that the room has atmosphere, but you don't discuss the wallpaper. Objects are artful. They hide their power to determine the way we feel. So in these kind of, everyday moments, what Miller is doing is situating how, essentially, things that are in our lives are our lives. And we can't really have lives without them. We can't have this kind of... The things themselves are culture in that sense. And therefore are full of all the inequalities and meanings that cultures have. But on a day-to-day level, they have these kind of emotional, affective things that, are the very ingredients of life.
And I think what's really powerful about this is not just a Western thing, which is often our idea about these kind of behaviours. Then that's just in a society where there's abundance. This is a very common trait in a middle-class house in Nigeria or in India. And even if you go to a small house in a small village, there's photos of loved ones. There's objects that have been gathered when someone went to the city for a visit and they brought something back. They brought back a plate. They brought back a thing. And one of the things you used to see a lot in countries where cameras and photographic devices weren't evident, there would often be at any place, any scenic place, a garden, a zoo, a landmark, someone going around with a camera who takes your photograph, gives you the print so you can put it back home, so that you have a memory of time spent and time shared. And so I think one of the reasons I think Miller cuts through is because what he does propose is universal in most societies.
Yeah.
And I think that's powerful because we often split to this highly consumerized West and this kind of ascetic and more considerate and sparse rest of the world. And I think empirically that's false.
Yeah. Yeah.
And dangerous thinking, actually.
Yeah. And the photo example then is a good example. I mean, fun parks or whatever have those things on the rides where you then go and pay $20 to get a photo. Okay, so that's a capitalist exercise of making money.
Yeah.
But then, that's a funny thing that you own and you can talk to people with and it's experience. So there's there's an ambivalence there of things that's going on that needs to be considered.
When I used to work in part of the Indian border region, I would see these photographs in almost everybody's house of this one garden. And after several months of I said, what is this place? Oh, it's Kakchin Gardens. It's just a small town, but it has this beautiful garden on the top of a hill. And I ended up writing a paper about this garden, actually. But it just took from... Everyone has been there at some point. And there's always with someone, with other people, with relatives, with friends. And it just became this kind of thing you would encounter everywhere. And it's just a memory of a place and time, particularly in a really violent and militarized place where life was ordinary and fun. And you dressed up and you looked good. And I think that's a really important thing. That these things are ways of capitalizing on memory and time. But for people, they're really meaningful, and they're a reflection of the extent of their social life.
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave that section here, and the last section we'll discuss, the positives and negatives of some of aspects of Miller's work.